Next, we're going to have a panel here that sort of builds on top of that idea of crowdsourced security programs, right? Of these public and private bug bounties, and how utilizing the crowd side of regular penetration tests is accretive for banks and payment companies. So with me to have this conversation is Jay Kaplan, the pride of East Brunswick High School. Go Bears. He is the CEO and co-founder of Synack. We grew up a town apart. Sit one down, Jay. That's my seat. Karl Schimmeck. He's the global head of vulnerability management at Morgan Stanley. And Mikhail Sosonkin. He is a security researcher and hacker on the Synack platform. So most importantly, while we have this conversation, I think it's really important for you guys to get a lot out of it and to kind of continue to ask questions over Slido. So Jay, I just thought I'd start with you. I mean, where does like a penetration test kind of fit inside of a vulnerability management program? Like, how important is that?
So I think it's important to contextualize this for everyone in the room, because I don't think everyone is necessarily a security practitioner, right? So many years ago, this whole idea of creating a model where hackers would basically be utilized for good to help companies understand where their vulnerabilities are, but in a very controlled way, where you would basically hire a consultant to come in, they would find bugs, they'd find vulnerabilities, they'd report them, and then they would ultimately be fixed. That has worked for many years, except the realization came that there are way too many applications out there in the internet. There are way too many devices, millions and millions of devices. How do we protect everything? And so penetration testing has ultimately evolved into this new model of crowdsourcing.
Sure, but I mean, before we get into that, like, before we talk about those crowdsourced models, like, Karl, I mean, just talk about how important this is, how important regular testing is in like this digital transformation.
Sure, yeah. So penetration testing, for like Morgan Stanley's example, we've been doing it for 10 plus years. So it's not a new concept of wanting to test our applications and infrastructure for vulnerabilities. But I think what we're starting to see now is our regulators, so whether they be HKMA or Monetary Authority of Singapore in Asia, Bank of England in Europe and the EU, and then in the US, FRB and OCC, they're trying to push us to, okay, how can we continue to evolve the model of the testing we're doing, get more effective testing, and also do more testing in production. So to that point, what we're seeing now is the crowdsourcing model of starting to come through.
And so, Jay, there's a lot of different forms of this crowdsourcing model, right? I mean, it's not just like a public bug bounty that I put out to the world, right? I mean, there are different tiers of this model, and just go there.
Yeah, I mean, in the same way that penetration testing has evolved, this whole concept of crowdsourcing has evolved as well. About 10 years ago, Mozilla introduced the first bug bounty program, where they basically said, if you are a hacker out on the internet and you want to responsibly come forward and disclose a vulnerability, we'll pay you some money for it. Many other companies have jumped on to say, okay, this model makes sense. We can't scale our own security teams in the same way, but we need the people. People are fundamentally really important for scale. And so companies like Facebook and Google have introduced similar bug bounty programs. But what happened was a lot of conservative organizations said, look, there's just too much risk, especially in the financial services space. We don't know who these people are. They're not really vetted. It's kind of an open invitation to just come hack us. We can't take on that liability. And so that's where we've evolved the model, actually, at Synack, where we said, let's create a new enterprise accessible model where organizations can ensure that the people working on their projects are highly vetted. They still get the advantage of having hundreds of hackers working on their applications and networks. But then let's also instill technology to insert trust and control into the process, and that becomes really important.
So there's this idea of like these public programs, private programs, and then what you do specifically is you start crowdsourcing traditional penetration tests.
That's exactly right. So the important point here is that a penetration test is something that follows more of a methodology, right? You actually have a list of items that need to be checked off to ensure that you have comprehensive and holistic coverage across standards that have been created by a number of bodies, whether it's PCI compliance, OWASP compliance, GDPR. You have to conform to some sort of standard, and that's where penetration tests are different than a bug bounty. Bug bounty is more like, I'm going to go find any vulnerability I possibly can. The cool part is that you can now actually get that compliance piece utilizing a crowdsourced model, we actually introduced and innovated in this space where we said, okay, we're now going to take advantage of these same hackers that are finding vulnerabilities, but we're going to actually utilize them to complete the compliance checks.
So Mike, I mean, you participate in this platform. What does, I mean, I think everyone in the room has an idea of like what a hacker looks like. What does this community actually look like?
Yeah, interesting question. I mean, a lot of these people are kind of just professionals. They're looking to diversify their experience. They're looking to make a little extra money, and they're looking, maybe they're coming from a background that is different than security, Like Jay mentioned, there is this mechanism on the platform where you can do individual tasks or you can find vulnerabilities, So that allows people from various different backgrounds, like developers, to actually come in and like have that security experience.
And I think that's really fascinating, right? Because when we talk about this model and we talk about the talent gap, I think Philip alluded to it earlier, that there is this great talent gap and there is this need for apprenticeship. So I mean, specifically within crowdsourced penetration testing, I mean, is this bringing people into the talent pipeline that otherwise wouldn't be there?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I've had a lot of friends who want to get into security, and they do so through a bug bounty platform. They need some sort of guidance, and they need a way to kind of understand if this is for them. They need a way to learn and get the experience without having to pass an interview, go to have courses of that sort.
And Jay, that's interesting because the idea of cybersecurity education inside universities is fairly new.
Yeah, absolutely. It's still a very nascent field. There is still not a lot of formalized educational programs, and so this is almost a mechanism for our next generation of cyber warriors to be trained.
Cyber warriors, yes.
And the cool thing is, developers participate in these security programs, these bug crowdsourced programs, and they're people who probably wouldn't be that exposed to security, but ultimately they're the most important people in the strategy because they're the ones that are inserting bugs into the code in the first place. I think Karl could attest to the fact that it's so hard to find these people and it's so hard to recruit them and then let alone retain them. I know the banks are really, really struggling. They're fighting. They're paying a ton of money, but even the money isn't enough.
Yeah.
And so how do you actually take advantage of mind share across the world, people who are really smart at doing this work, but obviously do it in a controlled
Talk about that recruiting challenge inside of Morgan Stanley.
So first off, trying to first find a pen tester and then keep them interested. So a lot of them, money obviously is one reason why they want to do it, but challenge and variety is another. So as a single firm, there's only so much variety and challenge that you can provide somebody. So that's where we think, using either a vendor or using these crowdsourced models, these provide then the pen testers with just much more challenge and variety in what they can go do. They can go across different banks and go do testing. They can see similarities. They can start to bring lessons learned across the banks. And this ties to like a fundamental kind of principle that we have amongst, I'd say, all of financial services. When you look at the FSI SAC and some of the other kind of groups that are out there, that we want to work together because there is not enough resources out there, not enough smart people. So we try to leverage them as much and as broadly as possible and share as much as possible.
I mean, just to be clear, Morgan Stanley is considering launching like a crowdsourced penetration, a regular crowdsourced penetration test now. Why?
Yeah, it goes, I think, to one is, again, the model's evolving where we're trying to find the best testers that are out there and the ones we can do it. A lot of it goes to the way we're developing our software now. So we're in the process of making a full transition to an agile and DevSecOps model for our application development. So with that model, what we're looking is basically a shift left and shift right. So as much automation as we can build into the way we're scanning and helping our developers not put vulnerabilities into the code and then get out of the way in the middle, allow them to release, give them transparency to what they're releasing, and then do as much testing as we can after release, and in that continuous kind of testing and monitoring model that you can get from a Synack and kind of similar companies out there.
I'll stay with you for one more minute, then I'll kind of move things around a little bit more. But was there a specific event that caused you to kind of consider this? Was it just a part of a larger digital transformation, or?
No, I mean, I think this is just it's part of that kind of evolution in digital transformation. So, it probably comes as no shock to the people in the audience that, banks are very much just a big technology company with a bank wrapped around it. I mean, we have thousands of developers, thousands of applications. Technology is absolutely core to everything we deliver to our customers. So, evolving our security programs along to help enable that is just core to that. And we're under efficiency pressure. We're trying to find the best testers, and we feel like this is a model that can kind of
So
give
it's a
us
real
that
business
leverage.
management issue, right?
Absolutely.
This is a question of economics. This isn't a question of technical security. Mikhail, we had a conversation last night about this many eyes principle, right? That just because a lot of people look at something, there's almost a herd mentality, and that doesn't mean that the most important things get fixed. You used to be the director of research at Synack, and I know you worked on a program to sort of incentivize kind of breaking up that principle. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the things we kind of quickly realized is that you may have many eyes on a particular target, but the problem is that these people, they talk to each other, they kind of get hints from similar places, and so they group along the places that they think they have skills in, or they think they might have better chances in, and it creates a very kind of like poorly covered attack surface. And so the program we worked on is essentially a way to figure out where the hackers have been, where they've tested, and then figure out how do you incentivize for them to go into the harder places, or places maybe they haven't even realized that were there. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of a middle ground between, okay, well, we have a fully chaotic, let's say the open source version, many eyes on the same problem, versus the very well controlled solution where there's some authority at the top that says, okay, you have to go in this direction, you have to go in this direction, and these are the coverages we have to cover. But somewhere in the middle, you use incentives to get people to go to the places that you've discovered haven't been looked at as much as you'd want them to be.
I think we're getting some good questions right now, and I think this first question is a chance to kind of break up a misnomer. Do crowdsourced penetration tests become the main source of bug detection? Or should it work in conjunction with more automated methods of testing, or even traditional testing? Anyone can answer that. Karl, your eyes got wide, my friend.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, when you look at the economics of it, at the end of the day, pen testing very late in the cycle is expensive. It's expensive to execute. It's expensive to go fix. So there's very much that focus of we want to find it as early as possible so it can be fixed in the development cycle as cheaply as possible. So those things never get out to production. So there is no doubt this is one of many testing methodologies and
it's
methods
additive. It's not a replacement.
No, absolutely.
At any level, whether it's a public bug bounty or private or even a crowdsourced penetration test. Jay, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we actually fundamentally believe that that this will become the new industry best practice and the de facto standard for how penetration testing is conducted, but it needs to be done in a very methodology-driven way, in addition to the ad hoc component. And when you combine the two, to what Mikhail was saying, is finding that balance in the middle where you're getting the advantage of creativity of the hacker, having them kind of do what they do best, thinking like the adversary, but at the same time utilizing the same methodology you've been utilizing all along. You can create one report, one comprehensive assessment of an environment, which I think checks all the boxes.
So Karl, Mikhail, just a natural question is, why didn't banks have access to these crowds before?
I mean, a lot of hackers don't really want to work for banks, to be honest.
Why?
I think a lot of hackers tend to have the mentality of, they want to have the freedoms and they want to have sort of this uncontrolled aspect in their work, and be able to have their own sort of like manifest destiny, like be able to make the decisions themselves. And if you work in a big corporate environment, it's hard to do that. And you kind of, you could get lost, you might not necessarily get to do things you want to do, and so they choose to go to places where they essentially can just go and hack.
Yeah, Karl, I mean, that sounds like a strong accusation, because what Mike is actually saying is that the best people don't want to work for you.
I would say this is when you go to a bank, we're a regulated entity, we have responsibility to our clients, and we have to do things I think to Jay's point, in a structured way. I think what you're seeing right now with the emergence of companies like Synack, you now are finding that proper balance to where it can be applied in a structured way with controls in place, with transparency of who's doing the testing, and then we can get kind of the best testers, we can get their most creativity, we can apply them in the most diverse way. So I think we're finding that right balance of providing a little bit for everybody, but yes, I mean, we are structured in the way we have to go about it.
And Jay, because of like kind of this kind of loose background, this like sort of informal background that a lot of these folks have, they might not necessarily have the straightest paths, right? Like they might not be able to pass a background check at Morgan Stanley.
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, we do a lot of diligence on the folks that come into our
Of course.
community. We actually background check every single person.
Absolutely, yeah.
And our customers demand that. You know, when you're working,
Of course.
when you're working with 10 federal agencies, including the DoD and you know, the IRS, you know, they have
A lot of
scrutiny.
folks have clearance on your platform. Absolutely.
They do. But with that said, I mean, you know, A, they might not be wanting, they don't necessarily want to work for these banks, and B, yeah, there is a lot of additional, I think, process and scrutiny that you guys put people through.
Well, and there's also, I mean, I think there's a lifestyle component too. Is people, again, it goes to the variety, it goes to the ability of, I want to work from home, I want to work when I want to work. So I think like providing, again, it's that balance where you can give a win to everybody.
Picture this, like
Yeah.
we have hackers that email us all the time or tweet to us all the time saying like, hey, look at me, like making, you know, thousands of dollars sitting on the beach in Maui. You know, it's a pretty cool idea that they can start to do this even as a full-time job. Some of them are saying, look, I'm making enough money from this. We actually just had a security researcher pass the $1 million mark, which in like a 16-month period, which is pretty exciting.
Well, that's very exciting. So I mean, it's kind of like the evolution of the gig economy, right? I mean, am I thinking about that correctly, Jay? And I want to move to some of these other questions. I mean, it's sort of like the evolution of the gig economy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you draw the parallel between, you know, bug bounty, crowdsourced security testing, and Uber, it's very analogous, right? These people are able
Uber has, by the way, Uber has the best public bug bounty program that's like, they always pay out. They have a lot of attention to detail. I mean, if there's one program to kind of emulate, I would think it would be Uber's.
I don't know that much about it, but I know I don't know if they've suffered. Have they suffered a major security breach? I'm not sure.
Oh, well, so they have, right? But and I think they foolishly paid out a bounty through their bug bounty. They paid out a ransom, an extortion through their bug bounty program. But that's not how that extortion came through.
Okay. Well, maybe Martin could shine some more light on that in the next section.
Yeah. Well, we'll stay away from that. I think this next question goes to perverse incentives, and it comes from our friend Klaus. What prevents a hacker in a program from selling known vulnerabilities on the dark web for more money?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question that comes up a lot, particularly with our customers. And I think the reality is the vulnerabilities that are being found in these type of programs are not the same type of vulnerabilities that are being sold to nation states who are paying tons of money. My background was NSA, right? So the stuff that was really valuable to us are 0 days in Windows operating systems, Linux, now iOS, Android. That's the stuff that's really valuable on the dark web. And so this whole idea of like, okay, we found a vulnerability in Morgan Stanley and we're going to go sell it. It's much more theoretical than practical.
And I just want to say
I don't know how Karl feels about that.
Mikhail, I'm going to switch to you guys, but I just want to make something very clear. The offensive marketplace is very small, and the risk to reward ratio just doesn't exist. Why would I take on that amount of risks when if I can like root Chrome, I get $100,000? Like that's a lot of money with no risk.
And what we tell our customers though also, and quick point, is it riskier to not engage in these type of programs and leave these vulnerabilities sitting out on the internet, or is it riskier to take that tiny chance that maybe someone sells something which is
because in the past
unlikely.
most people just hoard. Yeah, Karl.
Maybe I can add a little bit to that as well. Is that if you're a researcher on the platform, first of all of your risk goes away because they kind of take care of it. Right? All you're doing is you're doing the technical work, you're doing the stuff that you're interested in, so you're just sitting there and hacking. And like Jay said, people they make a lot of money on that platform. If you kind of go into these gray markets or even black markets, your risk profile increases hugely because companies don't want you to do that. Yep. And so if the environment changes right now, it's kind of good for the black hats because they have a lot of power. It's kind of asymmetrical, right? But if the environment changes, suddenly you could be in a target.
I mean, also wanted to say that's against the law. So if you start to do those things, you're breaking the law. You can be arrested, prosecuted, and I mean, and that's it is against the law to hack. Hack a company's system. You're not allowed to do that.
CFAA in this country very strong. So is DCMA is very strong in this country. Let's keep on going with these perverse incentive questions. Like, is a crowdsourced bug bounty utilizing any insider provided information? I think that's against the scope, but yeah, we'll talk about scoping for a minute.
It really depends on, I think, the program. We have customers that want to do stuff that's not completely black box. They'll provide test credentials, they'll provide diagrams of their architecture, and the goal there is to say, hey, look, if there was a highly motivated hacker out there, maybe even an insider that was able to get access to this information, then what could they do? Or if credentials are compromised all the time, they're sitting out, for purchase, taking the assumption that you can already log into the application, and then what can you do? I think that's really...
It's just different scenarios you want to test. So it's, look, we know our employees are getting phished all the time. These things can happen. So it's like, if the first layer breaks down, do we have additional layers that are going to provide that support? So we're kind of covered. So we try all scenarios.
And just taking a database approach, most security incidents don't arise from a series of vulnerabilities, right? They mostly arise from credential reuse, credential stuffing. That's how attackers really establish persistence and move laterally. Am I thinking about that right, Karl? You can sound mature.
No, I would say that is like, usually you're not going to have somebody going up against our perimeter and just banging away at it, trying to find a vulnerability. They're going to look at our weakest position, which would be typically your people, and they're going to find a way to socially engineer them, get their credentials, do something, get through that perimeter, and now, and then you come into an entirely different, a different issue of, limiting lateral movement, finding people in the networks.
Sure. There are very well-articulated malware strategies inside the bank. There are very well-articulated policies, compliance, and audit. But you can't control, someone getting socially engineered on LinkedIn.
Right.
Yeah. So let's move into more of that. Just like to level set, right? Like this. I hate conversations where everyone's talking about fantastic hackers and in hoodies. Mikhail, yes. Mikhail, you're not helping. My friend from Estonia.
Hackers are pretty awesome. Like you said before, it's a game of persistence, right? You kind of find something to hang on to, and then you start pivoting from different places. Like you go on LinkedIn, see who the employers are, who the employees are of the company. You start going after them, and it's kind of that process of just slowly, getting yourself inside and slowly gaining that information.
The best hackers use the best marketing tools, LinkedIn, Hunter.io, just using real OSN tools.
Oh yeah, open source intelligence is a huge thing. Where else are you supposed to start, right?
It's better with go ahead.
I was just going to say, bringing it back to kind of this discussion though about security testing, right? Like security testing is so important because it's the front door.
Yeah, 100%.
Right? The reason Equifax happened was because there was a known vulnerability that was never patched on an internet-facing application that compromised all of their customer records, right? So all of our records. And so like that, I think, you have to, they always say there's usually a hard shell on the outside and then a squishy middle once you get in. But we're finding more and more that hard shell is not as hard as people think.
Sure, but that's more of a question of security culture, which I think bleeds back into this topic of crowdsourced security models, right? Equifax might not have really enabled its security teams to be successful in that instance, right? There was still manual issues happening inside. Let's not talk about credit reporting agencies, but yeah, Karl, I saw you shaking your head, right? This is about security culture. It doesn't start at a technical level; it starts at a much higher level.
Right, and also I think not to just belabor the Equifax point, I think one of the things is this idea of continuous monitoring. When you can quickly spin up a team or a group of researchers to say, I need you to go after this right now and look for it to make sure it's not there. And the fact is automated tools don't catch all these things. So sometimes you need that human, you need it to happen quickly. And as we saw there, it was 2 days after it was reported, it was exploited.
Talk about why this is a better evolutionary step, why a crowdsourced security program. But is it just faster for time attack? Draw those comparisons between a traditional test and.
Traditional test is you either have an internal team and you have a limited number of people and you're going to go and look and you only have so many people and you have to cover so much ground that will take time. Here you have the scalability of the agility. You can say, I need you to check this specific thing with as many people as possible in as short a period of time as possible. And there's nothing better than giving somebody that challenge and letting them just beat it for 48 hours and see what they can find.
Mike, I think that's a really interesting kind of jumping off place. What's your approach? You talked about it a little earlier in terms of reconnaissance. What's your approach to finding a vulnerability when you're working within a platform?
Sure. One of the first things you kind of have to do is figure out what is kind of in scope, what is it that you want to find, right? Like
Sure.
once you set the goal, you know, that's kind of the good thing about being on a platform is that it tells you like, okay, I need to find a way to get credentials, right? So then you're kind of in a position to say, okay, well, I know what I want. I'm going to find as much tidbits of information out there, you know, from LinkedIn, from any sort of like open source intelligence, what sort of assets are being sort of disclosed on the internet, but that shouldn't be there.
Yeah.
Right. A lot of times when they shouldn't be there, companies don't even know they're there, and then it's like easy prey at that point. You know, it's very much a kind of the approach becomes very human oriented because you're using a lot of tools to do scanning, to do analysis, and then kind of like putting that and crunching that together and then directing that effort to find the actual technical flaws or maybe misconfigurations and just kind of things that companies aren't aware of in that nature.
And Jay, talk about like what that work actually looks like, right? I mean, I feel it just sounds very human to talk about, hey, I'm going to do a bunch of research up front. Like just like I was kind of thinking about, hey, I want to apply to a new job, right? Like I'm a marketer, I want to apply to a new job. I'm going to gather all this OSN, and then I'm going to start testing that. Like just talk about that process.
So data is so important. And like as an adversary trying to break into an organization, you're going to use every single thing you possibly can that's at your disposal. And you know, contextualizing that environment up front enables you to be more successful as a hacker. So one of the things we actually did at Synack is we created an automated platform that adds as much context to the researcher before they go in and do their work. So we'll do a full reconnaissance scan, we'll tell them, map out the environment, we'll tell them, you know, what known vulnerabilities are out there, and then have them go so that when Mike jumps in there for the first time, he's like, okay, wait, most of this work is already done for me. I can just start finding bugs and making money as fast as possible. So it's, I think, about adding efficiency. It's about, you know, being more productive and then being more holistic with what your researchers are actually looking for.
Karl, I saw you shaking your head just in agreement. I mean, do you want to plus any of that?
No, I mean, it's again, you've limited a number of people, you want to make the best use of their time, and you want to, you know, I think, to the points made is, you want to use the automated tools that are available, gather as much, provide some familiarity, and I think that's the repeatability of, you know, having a model like a Synack where you're going to see a lot of the same researchers over and over again coming into your, you know, into your environment and testing you versus just whoever, and they're all starting from scratch and doing all that work on their own.
Sure. And so let's just have I think we have 2.5 minutes left. Let's just have, Karl, let's just have a quick conversation about, you know, what specific regulators are asking about this sort of testing, if this is even trickled up to that level.
Sure. So penetration testing, the regulators globally have been after it for a number of years. You know, whether you go into Asia, Europe, you know, even last week G7 put out a release talking about, you know, intelligence-led penetration testing. So this is out there. They look at it as very effective. They look at it as it's a way of demonstrating assurance and being very technical. So it's not a paper-based, you know, do you have processes in place? It is very tangible of, can this be broken into? Is it been hacked? And you can demonstrate it. The other thing is that what we've been trying to do as an industry is trying to pull this all together across all the different regulators, try to standardize as much as possible, where what we want is regulator-guided testing, and then allow the firms to lead that testing in the way that they see as most appropriate for the way they're structuring their business, their risk appetite, all those other things. So that combination between the two, that dialogue is open, and I think we've made a lot of strides as an industry there.
Jay, anything to add?
Well, I mean, I think it's important that you have some regulation, some level of compliance and standardization that companies have to conform to. There's no playbook today for cybersecurity. It's one of the hardest challenges. I saw someone was asking a question: how do I hire a CISO? It's really hard, right?
Well, there's a whole interim CISO marketplace, right? Like our friends at Duo, our friends at, you know, there's a ton of smaller Defense Storm.
And one of the reasons it's so hard is because there is no like formal education to be a CISO. There's no standards. And so, you know, as this stuff becomes more and more formalized, then it's about how do we actually map what we're doing inside the organization, like testing, to those standards. And I think that's where we'll start to see an evolution.
Great. And so we have exactly 30 seconds left. One best practice from each of you before we invite more of our friends on stage to kind of hang out with us.
Well, for me, it's think like a hacker at your organization. Think about where would someone get in if they were to try, and put yourself in their shoes. And then think about, once they get in, what are you going to do? Have a plan.
That's good security culture, and making really good plans for when things inevitably go wrong, so assuming breach.
Yeah, cybersecurity is something, it cascades to the entire organization. It's not a technology issue. It is something that every firm has to consider from the top down, and it's every employee's responsibility to think about it and act accordingly.
Awesome.
Honestly, hackers are going to hack, and
hackers are going to hack. Hackers are going to hack, baby.
Believe it or not, they're actually motivated to make things more secure. So it's better to have them on your side.
There are way more good hackers than bad hackers out there. Yeah. We'll put it that way.
Yeah, of course. Well, nobody wants to take on that risk. Nobody's trying to go to jail. With that, please clap for these 3 people. Please, make me feel better. And so now we're going to go into this, I think, interesting Ask Me Anything session, where we're primarily just going to take questions from the audience. So with that, I really want to invite back my friends, Philip Martin, everyone, from Coinbase. Please clap for him. I'm not going to stand up. And Martin Mikos, the CEO of HackerOne. So I was hoping we could, I asked a polling question earlier in the day about how companies kind of choose to add new security technologies or processes. Can we put that back up? What's the number one thing up there? I can't see. Is that responding to a risk? Someone tell me. Yes. So,
there it is.
Oh, it's right there. So it's addressing new risks as they emerge or as they are discovered. I mean, so I think that's really interesting. A security incident is second, regulatory compliance is third. I think that's a really fantastic place to start, because it sounds like most people in the audience that compliance isn't really like a first step. You know, Philip, maybe you could react to that a little, right? Like how do you get a meeting inside of your organization? Do you see privacy as like an enabler of new business? Like how do you think about that? Just kind of responding to that poll.
Yeah, I think the number one thing that is making us move and change and adapt is our broadly speaking new or emergent risks in the space, right? That and that should be defined very broadly. That could be we're tracking a new threat actor group that has these TTPs and the capabilities, or it can be there is a new California in a future world just passed new privacy legislation, right? Mm-hmm. Those all bring risks to the program.
Karl, do you see privacy as an enabler of new business inside of Morgan Stanley?
I mean, privacy it's natural. We have a regulatory requirement, GBLA. We have to ensure that we're taking all the privacy concerns for our clients, whether it be their financial assets or information. So it's naturally a huge driver for everything we do. But when you also look at the other pieces out there, when look at a breach, we look at operational concerns, we look at impacts. As you look at the array of different threat actors who are going against the banks as financial services being critical infrastructure, we have to take a lot of different scenarios into account. So privacy just being one.
Sure. So I just want to go to this first question. There's been a lot of discussion around solving for vulnerabilities, but what advice do you have to reduce like the attack surface kind of in the first place? Anyone who wants to, Karl, go ahead.
I'll throw it. Probably the best thing you do is it's hygiene. It's just keep things patched, use up-to-date systems, continue to perform maintenance on your system. It's core technology. Like I think when you allow your infrastructure to not be funded and to be refreshed on a periodic basis, you're adding risk to your entire technology stack. So kind of keep making sure you have that agility that you can patch quickly and don't tolerate fragile systems any longer. I mean, those will just slow you down.
One of the things that we hear over and over again is like we don't even know what's out there, right? Yeah. And so I think having proper inventory of all of your assets, all of your applications, all of your endpoints, I think that's like step one.
Yeah.
And then obviously.
Proper asset management is so important because on a good day in IT, I only know about 95% of my endpoints, and then there's like 5% that are connected to the internet, and my friend Mike can do anything he wants with them.
not just that, right? But you think about as you bring services and applications and whatever else into the company, there's normally a gate, right, when you bring it in. Right? A year later, what's that thing being used for? It's probably a very different answer with a very different threat profile. So it's not just about asset inventory up front. It's about more maintaining situational awareness across the board in your enterprise.
Yeah, I think it's important to basically say, do I need this feature and how badly do I need it? Because that feature represents, or that service represents, a gateway for a hacker or an attack surface. So you can say, well, maybe I don't need this service there, and just take it offline and make it work somewhere else.
Martin, you raised your finger.
Yeah, we talk about risks with new software, but there's so much old software that will never be secure again. And if we go to our heads of engineers that you just have to rewrite your application, it won't happen. But if we move, and when we move to the cloud, it actually gives a natural juncture to also change and improve the security posture. So I'm not arguing going cloud just per se, but when you do that, it's the perfect moment to make sure that the software you have that is protected, that it is secure, that you're using just a small set of frameworks and libraries so that you are on top of it. And you can do it as you are going cloud. So that's sort of a side benefit of moving from an on-prem infrastructure.
So Karl, how much of Morgan Stanley runs on COBOL? That's a joke. I don't expect you to answer that.
No, it's not a joke.
So it's not a joke. But,
We have old and new stuff. That's that's one of the challenges as you get into big companies is the array of different technologies, code bases, different languages that are used. I mean, we have everything. We have 10,000 plus developers, 5,000 plus applications. I mean, it's a broad spectrum of things you have to manage, and it goes to your point on like the unsexy inventory management and understanding what we're using things for.
yeah, I mean, hacking is really about being pedantic. Like your adversary is super pedantic. Like the best hackers are probably the best fishers, and they're really guys like me that sit in their basement and they just get really heavily obsessed. Mike, can you talk about that for a little while? They're just a nerd.
Yeah, I mean, I sit in the basement and hack all day, pretty much. That's kind of what I like doing, so it's not necessarily a bad
get
thing.
into that mindset, though, right? It becomes easy. I think everyone in this room can kind of relate to obsessing over a problem, right? Just getting on Shodan is another way of just kind of like obsessing over a problem, obsessing over kind of like machines that are exposed to the internet.
There's a huge dopamine effect of when you actually find something and it's cool. But everything up until that point is really, really boring.
Sucks.
It's all about persistence, though, right? Because eventually you're probably going to find some vector to get in. I mean, I worked the counterterrorism mission at NSA. If we didn't get in, the consequences were dire, right? And so you just keep going. And I think, whether it's socially engineering, whether it's probing for vulnerabilities, you're just going to do everything you possibly can if you have a mission. But there's always the question of, what is the ultimate motivation? If you're really locking, like if a bank does a really great job of locking the front door, does a hacker go, all right, you know what, it's too hard over here, let me go move on to the next one. And at some point, the economics don't work out for the hacker, I guess.
Yeah. So I think this is really interesting because now we're talking about cybersecurity like a business management issue, not like a technical issue. And that gets at the heart of culture. Karl, I saw you shaking your head. Anything to add to that?
Well, I think your point on culture is key, and I think it goes back to like the way we develop our applications, where our infrastructure is managed. Is culturally, 10 years ago, you would go back and say, people would release code and it'd be buggy, and they'd be like, that's just the way code is, and you just live with it. Now we've gotten to a point that the higher level of quality for bugs being removed before you release that's kind of the standard, and now we want that for security, and we're starting to see that evolution of at the core, the developers are saying we can't release unsecure code. We can't put vulnerabilities in there. They have to come out.
And just to triple underline that, cybersecurity culture is in cybersecurity awareness training, right? It's a really a top-down thing where you're actually considering security in the software development lifecycle.
It's low quality code at the end of the day. If you're putting vulnerabilities in, and you're not a good coder if you're doing that.
Yeah. Philip is someone who lives and dies on the application.
Yeah, so we talked about in the panel I did with Martin. I see this as a fundamentally a behavior problem, right? So, like I said there, no one wakes up in the morning and says, "How can I ship really vulnerable code today?" That's no one's like cup of coffee. Let's ship some vulnerable stuff, right? They do it because they don't understand the problems, they don't understand the security requirements, they don't understand the tools. So it becomes from our point of view, it becomes a cultural concern of how do we get them aligned with.
It's about incentives, right?
Incentives.
If I'm in DevOps, I'm incentivized to ship fast code.
Yep.
Right?
Well, ship code fast.
Yeah, exactly. And so I am moving against your developers. Like this whole idea of secure DevOps is sort of anathema to me. I don't understand it.
I completely disagree with that. Right?
Tell me.
It's not because just because you're shipping code fast doesn't mean you're shipping code insecurely. Right? It's all about the tooling and the ability of the developers to know and get feedback about their code.
So, Philip, would you agree, though, that actually getting a vulnerability on code that you write is probably the best way to educate yourself about how to write better code?
Absolutely. Right. We focus, when we do training, we do it on our code.
Yeah.
Right? We either do it with...
you should do it on other people's code. Sorry for interrupting.
No, please,
but you
go
should
ahead.
do it on everybody's code. You should read everybody's vulnerability reports because then you know what the hackers are trying to break in on.
So I think this next question is a little bit broader, but I think it centers us a little bit more. How do you think moving to the cloud affects the attack surface? Anyone can answer that about misconfigured. If anyone wants to know about misconfigured servers,
I mean, as far as hackers go, they kind of like that because at least right now, it's pretty hard to track all your assets across the cloud. And sometimes it's hard for enterprises to define what is an asset. Before you'd say, well, this is a machine, it's got ports, so that's an asset. But like now, well, I've got a service, it's got an HTTP connection, maybe it's got some ports, like maybe it's distributed across many clouds. And so it's hard to track that. People are not used to it. And so it's good for hackers to essentially say, oh, I know how to look for things out there, so I'm going to pick them up and be better at this.
So I think it's really interesting, right? Because a lot of what I see as successful hacks are where there's asymmetric knowledge, right? The attacker is bringing something to the table that the defender doesn't know. There's a great talk from the head of TAL 2 years ago at Enigma. It's recorded. You can search it, right?
I wrote about it.
There you go. And the fundamental takeaway for me from that was that, yes, the NSA may throw amazing, super cool 0 days, but most of the time it was just the brute force work of I know your network better than you do, so I win.
Exactly.
So in the cloud, if you're trying to lift and shift from where you are today, which is on-prem, to the cloud, and you're not changing the way you think about it, then yeah, you're going to cause problems.
And that's that idea about secure DevOps, because now I have no more guys that set up servers, and it's just my DevOps friends, and they're just setting up things on AWS. They're throwing like production level data on AWS, and perhaps exposing the entire internet.
Well, and it's also, I think when you go to cloud, it's very public. Like if you mess up, it's out there and it's going to be found right away. And the whole idea of like, well, that's a dev system or a test system or UAT or I test data or it's not real. It doesn't matter. As soon as it's out there and it's made public, it doesn't matter if it was fake tested. It looks and appears like it's real, and it's going to be a problem for a firm. So you cannot mess up when you have less room for error when you release.
Jay?
At the end of the day, though, these are still applications that, whether they're in the cloud or they're on-prem, they're just as vulnerable.
Of course.
So we have to do the same level of scrutiny from a vulnerability perspective as we did before. Just the new type of vulnerabilities are, it's just different, right? It's all about misconfiguration. Karl, the time and time again, we see customers just not configuring their cloud environments properly. They open it to the world, right?
Yeah.
And that's the biggest issue you have to deal with.
And that to me is especially scary when you have so many core banking systems being exposed to the open internet. Unpatched core banking systems being exposed to the open internet. So now financial technology companies can better interact with the bank.
Right.
Karl?
Well, but I also think there's like kind of the other benefits of the cloud. Like when you talk about what affects the attack surface, I think for smaller firms, they are able to increase their capability, many, many times when you talk about the security they're going to get by going to an AWS versus trying to build their own security program. So I think there's that benefit of, I think you talked about kind of the lift and shift. It allows you to kind of bring everything back up. But for smaller firms, I mean, you're getting a lot of the best thinking right out of the gate if you use the tools properly.
So just to answer that question, if you were a smaller startup, going to the cloud greatly reduces your attack surface. If you are Coinbase or Morgan Stanley, going to the cloud could kind of widen the attack surface. Am I thinking about that wrong?
I think you are.
God bless. Go ahead.
Right. So you talk about the DevOps guy shipping things fast. My DevOps team probably prevents more security issues before I even know that they might have been issues. Right?
Sure.
Because they know their tools, they know their environment.
Yeah, but you have the best developers on the planet because you're Coinbase. You're
Well, I
not
agree,
like Bank of Wisconsin, right?
Not
you do.
everyone, right?
You're in Silicon Valley.
But that's
give
one of the
go ahead.
benefits of the cloud is that when you operate on a cloud, you have security in the cloud, which is taken care of by the vendor. So you don't need to worry about that. And then you have security on the cloud where you are on your own as before, but others are running on the same infrastructure. So there's much better opportunity for pool defense and sharing experiences. Absolutely. If you're running your own environment, you have your own unique environment that nobody else can really help you with because you configured it. On the cloud, sure, you configure things, but there's much more similarity, and you can learn quickly from other people's problems and other people's solutions, which is more difficult than at home. That's why I believe it's generally you have a benefit of going to the cloud. But I also know that, of course, on the cloud there are new attack vectors. The hackers have new ways of coming in that you may not have thought about. But you hire those hackers, and then you have that skill.
But the transparency of the cloud probably, I think what you're trying to say is the transparency of the cloud sometimes works against you. So just to triple down on something, because I think we've been talking about this entire time, what is the fraudster or hacker's current favorite way to realize value against e-commerce merchants? And what is your prediction for kind of next year? Anybody? I can give my prediction. I can talk about my feelings.
They'll do all of them. They'll steal PII, they'll steal money, they'll break in, they disrupt.
Yeah, let's talk about fake accounts though, right? Because I think that's something that uniquely affects merchants, right? Like the actual creation of fake accounts, right? Like in terms of establishing persistence. The easiest way, what did a social network call fake accounts before 2016? User growth, right? I think a lot, I'm sorry, maybe that's not funny. I think that's something that still afflicts some of these payment applications today, is that a lot of their user growth is being driven by fraudsters.
Yeah, I think broadly identity is a problem on the internet. Identity is a problem in the world, quite frankly.
Correct.
But the internet makes it a little bit worse, both with the proliferation of major PII leaks like Equifax, but also just, we were never, the ecosystem of the internet was never built with this concept of a persistent human-tied identity built in, right? It's like trying to slap authentication on email after RFC 822 was put out. It just doesn't really fit. I think over the next year, over the next several years, we're going to see a lot of innovation in that space, in the identity space in particular. We see it with small countries today, like Estonia, right, that are bringing in national ID cards that have private keys on them, right? So we can start to be more a digital identity. I think we'll start to see more of that in various forms around the world.
Mike, shout out to Estonia.
Yeah.
God bless.
No, I think it's actually very much true. One of the reasons why sort of fraud is a problem is because a lot of personal information has been stolen and it's floating around out there, and you can't really change that. So there's not a lot of protection for people to, protect against getting impersonated, aside from just reducing that risk afterwards.
I was just going to say, I think password reuse continues to be obviously pervasive, and so these big breaches out there where passwords are getting compromised and then fraudsters are able to reuse those passwords across e-commerce environments. I think it's ridiculous that that's still an issue today, but with password managers it's making it a little bit easier. But I think until we get rid of passwords entirely, which is I think the movement, and it's happening right now, it's going to take us some time, but it's not going to happen in 19.
Account takeover identity is still central to that. I actually think, Philip, what you said was really interesting. When we talk about PII leaks, right? I can go out, I hit my mic. I can go out and I can just buy people's personal information today. I don't need to really steal it from anyone. Yep. And that gets at the heart of what's the problem with identity, because it's all for purchase for marketers. And as some of these data brokers seek larger markets, it's going to become easier and easier to purchase. Yep. Right? So let's, Karl, I think this would be a good question for you. How do you build your own internal teams, red or blue, or even threat intelligence? Where do you find talent safely without outsourcing it?
It's a difficult question.
It's the hardest question.
Yeah, no, it's trying to, at the end of the day, trying to find the right people to run your program. It came out to that previous question, how do I pick a CISO and those sorts of things. It goes, I think there's a limited experience market out there, so it's you go out there and try to hire those people. Starting with your threat intel program is a good way of looking at it. There's a lot of services and things you can provide to do that. But I think at the end of the day, probably the best place ultimately, I think, to start if you really don't have a very big problem, look internally. Try to find people who know your company, who know your technology, and they want to learn the security component of it, because it's teachable. They can understand. So whether you're going to be hiring somebody externally and teaching them about your company, or the other way around, you're not going to get everything. It's imperfect. So I'd say start inside out, and you got something to work
Karl,
with.
you and I were talking yesterday about how at some point you have to say, like, we're not going to hire these people.
Right.
Right. It's not our core competency to be doing this work, and there are many companies that can do it for us. And so I think you have to obviously find the balance between the two, right?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really important point, is being honest with yourself about what is my company's core competence? Like, what do I need to have in-house and what do I not? What can I rely on third parties for? I'll give you a concrete example. In cryptocurrency, there aren't very many threat intel providers that are focused on cryptocurrency threat groups, and they tend to be distinct from financials. So that's something we have to build, because I can't credibly buy it. But if I'm going to go out and say, you know what, it's actually really hard to hire great blue teamers, how do I increase the effectiveness of my team? Then we start talking about orchestration platforms, or things that can take my team and make them punch above their weight class.
Mm-hmm. The next question I think is really great, because it talks about cybersecurity insurance as a mitigating control. If there are so many ways to be hacked, would you strongly recommend cybersecurity insurance? Where'd that go? Where'd the question go? Do you strongly recommend? Is it still there?
Yep. It's
down. Oh God.
One step down.
Well, do you strongly recommend cybersecurity insurance? Do we strongly as sort of a yes?
Absolutely. I think we're in the game of mitigating risk, right? One of the ways you mitigate risk is you make it less likely. Another way is you transfer it.
Yeah.
Right. So I think cyber insurance policies, as they're written and underwritten more broadly, pardon me, as well as like other asset insurance policies, right? Not everything we protect is
like a technology warranty.
Like a technology warranty, or like E&O policies, or in my world, like cryptocurrency insurance policies.
Stronger SLAs.
Right. That is a real mitigation to threat. Now, it can't hurt. It can't help reputation, but it absolutely can help you recover after an incident and respond to it.
Just to triple underline something that you said, I think when you start to determine what's a good policy, right, you actually have to look at take a data-based sort of approach and understand what your real threat model is. Karl, do you want to plus that at all?
I mean, yeah. With the insurance policy, there's such a lack of standardization today on the insurance policies. You need to know yourself. You definitely need to have your legal counsel look at it deeply. At the end of the day, it's there for the worst day you're ever going to have, when your whole you want to make sure you are going to be a going concern in the future. That's what it's there for. It's for that 1 in 100 years.
Martin, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think in cybersecurity you need multiple lines of defense. So you start by trying to develop software that is not insecure. And then when it's insecure anyhow, then you apply methods to remove the vulnerabilities. And then when that doesn't work, then you have an incident responsibility. And then you have the next line of defense. And at some point you need the insurance to be that fifth or sixth line of defense. But like with any insurance, if you don't know what your real threats are, you don't know what to buy for. Like it applies to your home. What do you buy the insurance for? What are the worst case scenarios you need to be protected against? And that's what they said, it's not standardized today, so you'll have to ask for it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Jay?
Yeah, I was just going to say, to the question where how do you determine what makes a good cyber policy, I certainly have an appreciation for those cyber insurers that are actually trying to quantify their risk and with real data, rather than just being like, answer a survey and we'll go give you a premium, right? Like, it's crazy how it's done, but it's evolving finally. Yeah. It's just so nascent today.
Insurers are actually starting to work with outsourced security providers in order to continuously assess that. Right. I mean, that to me is one of the largest trends in information security, that like insurers and underwriters are actually trying to become intelligent about how they actually give out individual premiums.
Yep. And we would obviously love to see if you engage in a crowdsourced security program.
Of course you would. And
you get a policy reduction, right?
Yeah. Don't you guys work? Don't you have a partnership with an insurer? Does HackerOne have a partnership with an insurer?
We do.
Yes.
And we do as well.
Yeah, everybody does. Yeah. And nobody talks about that, right? Like, but Philip, go ahead.
So if you look across other types of insurance, this is actually a not uncommon thing, right? If almost any other kind of insurance, you go to the insurer, I want to buy insurance for thing X. They're going to say, great, we have a partner, that helps do loss prevention or loss mitigation for thing X. If you're an armored car provider, you go buy cash transit insurance, specie insurance, right? They're going to say, yep, you can do that, but also talk to this dude, and we'll give you back 10% of your premium to go do preventative measures because it's good for us and it's good for you too. So as this market matures, we're going to see more of that, hopefully.
Okay, if I
Mike,
can
please.
add a little bit, I think it's a good idea to go towards cyber insurance. The devil is always in the details. How do you evaluate your resistance to the hackers? How do you evaluate your sort of quality of your code and your assets? And I think that's kind of mostly an unsolved problem, and people just mostly wave their hands at this point. Sure.
Philip, I feel like this is a question for you. How do you argue for cloud services from a security perspective for those that still feel on-premise is the only way to go?
So that's a hard argument to have in the abstract, right? Because why is there reluctance to go to cloud from physical? And there's a few common reasons I hear. One is stuff around, well, if we control the physical hardware, sort of we're more in control of our destiny, and the details can be like, physical security or availability or whatever. My answer there, broadly speaking, is these cloud providers sort of live and die by their SLA numbers. They have the most motivation in the world, and they're world class at that. Another area I hear come up when folks bring up this objection is sort of in line with the conversation that we had, like isn't this all just online then? And the answer is most of the sort of the top tier cloud providers, the Amazons, the Azures, those folks, they actually have a fairly nuanced structure internally. You can build analogous structures, right, to what you might think about in an on-prem environment from an isolation point of view, right? So we can get to a place where really we come down to the objection of, but other people are touching my computers.
Yes.
Is like where we end up a lot in this conversation, right? But there are other people who then have access, and normally when you poke that a little bit and say, well, do you have any vendors in your current physical infrastructure? You rapidly get to a place where, okay, other people can already touch my computers. Yeah. Right. So I think if meta answer, right, you drill down to what's the actual problem. What is the actual concern? What are we worried about losing going to the cloud? And most of the time, once you do that, there's a myth to debunk.
Anyone else want, Mike, you want to plug?
I like what you said about the incentives. So I used to work on Amazon Cloud team. And so I'm a huge proponent of the cloud, but the thing that I always like about it is that they have the resources and they have the people to actually work on security full-time all the time and in a very hardcore way. Your organization might not have that ability. And so being able to essentially be protected by those people is a huge benefit. So cloud kind of makes sense in that way.
I think one other thing is also, when you have, it's a forcing mechanism for standardization. So it forces you to make sure you're always staying on the latest technology. You're always pushing. So what you'll have if you do it yourself, you'll have a proliferation of all kinds of exceptions to all kinds of policies you'll have where the cloud providers will force you to do the right thing in many cases, and it's also everything's plumbed for automation right up front. So
and I think you said something that's really interesting. Like the future of security is really standards, like really strong standards that might be pushed by insurers, that might be pushed by the cloud, but in the future, security is boring.
Yeah, I mean, as Philip hit the point, is like my DevOps guys are not going to allow that to get pushed out into production. Like they have the gating mechanism, and it's all automated, so you have transparency to it.
Martin, I saw you getting excited.
Well, I think the key question here is how fast can you update and patch your software? Because to be secure, that's what you must be able to do. If you can do it on-prem, well, have at it. Then it's beautiful. It's just much more likely that you have a fast, agile process on the cloud than on-prem. But if you can do it on-prem, then of course it's better. But it has to do with the ability to quickly fix. Because we used to develop software so that it would not change. Our goal was to create software that would never change. And now we realize that for it to be secure, it has to be ready to change all the time. And that must be the guiding factor here.
We have a minute and a half left, and the latest question to me is most interesting is about information sharing environments. Everyone is trying to solve for their own issues, but when does collaboration come into play? Do banks, for example, talk to or share with other like-minded institutions?
Yeah.
That's it. That's a great one to end on.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I mean, FSI, SAC, we have FSARC, we have a whole bunch of acronyms for basically partnerships we've set up both across the banks, across critical infrastructure within the banks, and also with the government to share. I mean, that we wanted, it's a free lunch for us.
100% yes. Attackers don't have any compunctions about sharing. They learn from each other, right? The only way we survive is in a world where some attackers are coming after him and me is we collaborate and we learn together.
I mean, it's a joint mission, right?
Yes.
We're all dealing with the same threat actors. And if there is a known vulnerability that is working on our network, the likelihood that it can work on someone else's is very high. And so that collaboration is absolutely critical.
It's a non-competitive issue among the banks.
It's
Like one attacking against one is attacking against all.
Yep. Okay. And I mean, is there any player that's best? I mean, you mentioned FSARC, FSISAC. Are there any players beyond those nonprofits that are in a really good position to kind of?
I think there are probably
Coinbase publishes their vulnerability reports upon.
The hacker one, it's great. Go ahead, Phil.
There are about 1 billion, right? The security community is very interconnected and somewhat incestuous occasionally, but between like Slack groups and email lists and trust-based sharing groups and guys that have known each other for their entire careers sharing things over a beer, I think one of the best things about this community is that by and large we want to share and collaborate.
All right. So with that, I release you. The next panel, please everyone give these guys a round of applause. I really